bitches!
Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas, motherfuckers. I'm back a little sooner than expected. Holiday was short, but you know, I'm feeling it again. And by it, I mean the unyielding need to talk about a terrible cartoon. People seem to get really pissed off when they find out I'm still talking about this show, so let's talk about it more, why don't we? That sounds healthy. But what should we focus on for my triumphant return? So many topics. For the holiday season, why don't we talk about one of the greatest gifts of all, contradictions. I bring those up in, like every video? There's so many here. I'm going to be talking about a phenomenon that I've noticed in a lot of modern media, and also really bad fan fiction too, for some reason. Now, there's probably a term for what I'm going to be talking about in this video, but I haven't found it. But I did have a low budget, so my research being bad is not a problem. As I learned from this show, if you have a low budget, you can excuse any mistakes. But what am I actually talking about? Well, I'm going to be talking about lying. Specifically, lying to your own audience and trying to make them think that something that isn't true within your story is actually true. And I'm not just talking about misdirecting your audience for some sort of mystery plot or trying to confuse them to make the story more interesting. No. It's something far, far more devious than that. High Guardian Spice, being flawed in so many ways, acts as the perfect vehicle for me to talk about this issue I've been noticing, and it's happening more and more often. Not to say that this is new or anything, just it's becoming very common in big budget productions. I'm just going to put some B-roll back here. I'm sure it's not relevant to what I'm talking about, but yeah, lying to your audience. The issue I'm talking about today is something that has gotten really out of hand, I think, and it's getting worse. What I'm going to be going over is a method of sort of cheating your way through a story, trying to make the audience believe something has happened when it really hasn't. Trying to make them believe that something is happening in a very specific way, but if you take the time to actually, think about the events in the story and what's going on, it doesn't really make any sense. The best way I can explain this phenomenon is through the form of an analogy. Now, this is going to be very over-exaggerated, but it's just to get the point across. Now, I want you to imagine there's a story about a great adventurer, a hero, someone who goes out and fights for the sake of good. Everyone calls him a hero, they act like he's a hero, they cheer when he walks into the streets. But also, during the events of the story, the main character, the hero, decides to burn down a couple of orphanages, kick dogs every time he sees them, and blow up babies. The other characters never reference him doing any of this stuff, we just see it happen randomly and nobody comments on it. Throughout the entirety of the story, he keeps doing these terribly monstrous things and nobody points it out or does anything about it, and they still call him a hero throughout the entire thing. And then I want you to imagine a villain shows up, and the villain is shown filing his taxes. And he's treated as this awful monster who needs to be obliterated. And when the hero kills him, everybody cheers and claps, and it's all happy-go-lucky. But we also find out that off-screen, the villain kicked a couple puppies too, making him the bad guy. So I want you to notice how that series of events I just told you makes absolutely no fucking sense. Why is this maniac sociopath who burns down orphanages and kicks puppies being called a hero? And why, when the villain does the exact same thing, is he treated as a monster when the main character isn't? The reason it doesn't make any sense is because the story is lying to you. It's trying to make you believe that this main character is a good guy. But if you actually pay attention to the events on screen, he's not. There's a conflict between what the story is telling us and what the story is showing us. It would be really difficult to get immersed in a story like this because what's happening on screen is constantly being lied about. It feels like the story is fighting itself. Now, there are many, many ways this can be done in a story, but a lot of them are far more subtle than the crazy example that I gave you. I just gave you that so you can sort of understand what I'm talking about. One of the most common forms is trying to make you believe something about a character that just isn't true if you actually look at their actions on screen. Like, for instance, when a character is supposed to be sympathetic and likable, but they're written in a way that makes them unlikable and a monster. Or when we're supposed to believe a character is super intelligent when they make the dumbest decisions in every possible situation. I want you to think about some modern TV shows or movies where you think this applies. I guarantee you can come up with at least 5 examples off the top of your head. Now, to make it clear, there's a big difference between a dishonest story and one that's just lying for the sake of actually, building up the writing. You can have a villain character who's treated as a good guy early on for the sake of a plot twist later. You can also have morally gray characters who do both good and bad things, and it's up to the audience to decide where they stand. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is when a story wants you to believe that something is true when it's blatantly not. And there are several reasons why this could happen in a story. One of the most common ways is the writers could just be, kinda dumb. Maybe they didn't properly read through their scripts and ended up writing a bunch of contradictions into it due to their own incompetence. Or worst of all, they could actually believe some villainous actions a hero character does are 100% justified. Yeah, I know he blew up an orphanage and kicked puppies, but he's the good guy. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. So we got what I'm talking about set up. How does it apply to High Guardian Spice? Well, I'm glad you asked. Now, me being me, I've watched a lot of reviews of High Guardian Spice, and if you're a fan of my content, you probably have as well. Because of that, I don't remember which review exactly I heard this from, but I got a nugget of wisdom that causes a lot of the writing mistakes in this show to make way more sense if you look through a certain lens. That being that the authors are expecting us to fill in the gaps and take things for granted simply based on the fact that the story is the way it is. They're just magic girls going to a school, going on adventures, fill in the blanks yourself. There's a lot of very important information that's missing from the equation, but the writers don't actually feel the need to tell us all these things because they think we should just believe the stuff that's happening on screen is happening just because. They're taking elements from other stories without actually putting in the explanation that goes in between, so it causes things to make no sense if you take the time to think about it. To point this out, I would like to ask you a very important question. Are the Guardians the good guys? Well, the story seems to want us to believe so. You have the Guardians being cheered for and treated as heroes. They have these special vows about not being greedy or cowardly. They fight off deadly monsters to protect others. But if you actually think about it, everything that happens in the series seems to support the idea that the Guardians are actually the main villains. I'm serious, think about it. All the stuff that the Guardians do supports the idea that they're violent, monstrous sociopaths who only care about themselves. And it's so consistently executed that it almost feels like they were setting up a secret plot twist for the Guardians actually being the true villains all along. I guess it's all a part of that fabled Season 2 we're never gonna get, where they reveal all and turns out everything was actually well executed and well written. A boy can dream. To illustrate what I mean, there's actually a single line of dialogue in this cave episode that flips the entire thing on its head.
Why would a Trapper be evil? The well was dry. Maybe, without magic, they mutated?
How do we get back up?
That little 5-second exchange completely breaks this entire episode if you think about it too hard. So let's think about what Sage was actually implying there. Because of the fact that the healing water has been removed from this cave, there was a lack of magic, and the lack of magic caused the Trappers to mutate into monsters. Sage is a 14-year-old first-year student at this academy, and if she's able to figure it out this quickly, then the Guardians should also be able to figure this out as well. So let me get this straight. We are now aware that the removal of healing water from this cave is causing the creatures to mutate, turning them into horrific monsters and potentially damaging the environment as well. And despite that fact, the Guardians are constantly sending people down here to steal the healing water.
Your mission is to collect a vial of magical healing waters.
These maps show the caves and corridors down to level 3, where you will find the spring of healing waters. There are uncounted levels below and more springs, each with more concentrated magic, but protected by monsters. Below level 3, the risk level exceeds your training.
It's a good thing we've put strict protections around level 3 to make sure no students stumble down there and nearly get themselves killed. That would be terrible. So, lack of healing water leads to monsters. The Guardians should know this unless they're dumber than a 14-year-old first-year student. And yet, despite that fact, they're just like, hey, let's go down and steal some more. I'm not sure what exactly they're using all this healing water for. I'm assuming it's to, heal people? And if that's the case, they're purposefully damaging the environment for their own personal gain. And not only that, but they're also roping in vulnerable children to do their dirty work and not properly protecting them. And if they don't do their dirty work, they're threatened with immediate expulsion. As a little aside, why don't we talk about the actual villains of this show, the Triumvirate? Ooh. We know very little about them, but what we do know tells us that they're the foulest of villains. You see, they're causing this terrible thing called the rot, which is damaging the environment. Not to mention they're also using this underage girl Olive as their personal assassin, and if she doesn't do what they say, they threaten to kill her. Oh, it's so villainous. Man, they're so evil. And to show just how evil and villainous the Triumvirate are, let's compare their actions to the Triad and the Guardians. Alright, let's look at it side by side. The Triumvirate, the bad guys. They harm the environment for their own personal gain, use child soldiers, and also threaten them with death if they underperform. Ugh, so evil. Now let's compare it to the righteous, wholehearted Guardians. They harm the environment for their own personal gain, use child soldiers, and also threaten them with death if they underperform.
Wait a minute!
It is so bad that if you think about it, a lot of problems in the story would be solved if the Triad and the Triumvirate were actually the same exact group. I mean, think about it. Why do the Triumvirate have spies stationed at High Guardian Academy? Well, because the Triad are at High Guardian Academy. Why do the Guardians continue to do nothing about the rot? Because the Triad are causing the rot. Why do the Triad keep sending these girls off to these super dangerous missions they know they probably won't succeed? Because they want them dead. Why did the Triad suddenly disappear in the final episode when Mandrake attacks the school? Because they knew he was coming. Now, of course, I don't actually think this is the case, and it obviously wasn't the writer's intention, but the fact that you could come to this conclusion at all just proves to me how terrible this writing was. Because this whole plot rests on a lie, the lie that the girls are actually working with the good guys. They want us to just believe and take for granted the fact that the good guys are supposed to be good. If you actually take the time to think about the stuff they do in the story, they turn into villains. They poison children, they harm the environment, they do all the terrible stuff the Triumvirate does. But when the Triad and the Guardians do it, it's not treated as evil. They're treated as the good guys all the same, even when it doesn't make any sense. This is what happens when you don't actually take the time to prove the thing that you want the audience to think is true. They want us to, on one hand, believe that the Triad and the Guardians are the good guys we should be rooting for, while also on the other hand having them do all these terrible things, either for dumb jokes or just because the plot wanted it to happen. But to further prove my point, let's talk about another big contradictory lying moment that happens in the story, that being the entire episode with Aster. Now, before I say anything about this episode, I need to make something expressly clear. This section is going to lean dangerously close into some political stuff. I try to not bring up the whole political storm surrounding this show that often, but it does manage to sneak its way in sometimes. I'm going to try and avoid it as much as I possibly can because I don't want this to get bogged down with a bunch of political debates and arguments instead of actually talking about the writing of the show. So let's try to keep that to a minimum, okay? Okay. So to put it bluntly, the way Aster is treated in this episode is very strange. He does several things in this episode that other characters have also done way more often, and yet when he does them, the story punishes him. One thing that's made clear from the get-go is that Aster is a complete moron. He's an idiot, he's very clumsy, he does dumb stuff all the time. And when he acts dumb and clumsy, it's used to make us dislike him. That's the intention here. The writers want us to be in the same position as Sage, seeing this guy as a complete buffoon that Rosemary shouldn't be wasting his time with. And his constant screw-ups and failures are treated as a nuisance, and by the end of the episode, Rosemary is hating on him because of all the clumsy, stupid stuff he's done.
My name is Rosemary.
Are you sure?
Yes, it's Rosemary. And I know how to use a compass. It's your turn to follow me.
And that's all well and good, except for the fact that, for the most part, throughout the series, Rosemary is also a clumsy idiot. She's a constant screw-up who's often causing trouble because of how much of an idiot she is. Throughout the series, she's just as much of an idiot as Aster, if not more so, except for in this episode, where she suddenly pulls a bunch of skills out of her ass. I guess she learned all that off-screen. Very riveting. When Rosemary acts like an idiot, the authors want us to take it as endearing and funny, but when Aster acts like an idiot, the authors want us to take it as he's a terrible person and also a terrible guardian and Rosemary shouldn't be with him. It sets up this weird paradoxical world where one character can do one thing and it's perfectly fine, but when another character does the exact same thing in basically the same circumstances, it's suddenly a huge issue and that person is a terrible villain. But being an idiot isn't the only reason Aster draws in some negative attention, it's also because he's kind of a sexist. Aster throughout the episode treats Rosemary as being inferior, thinks he's better than her, and also thinks that her only job is to stand around and look cute. So basically he's being sexist without even realizing it, and it's causing Rosemary to get very uncomfortable around him. Imagine being off-putting to other characters because you're kind of an idiot.
Should we have a signal in case anything goes wrong? Something like, that's gibberish. You don't know our language.
So by the end of the episode, Rosemary has decided she's had enough with his antics and abandons him, and then he gets his toe smashed by Parsley, which I won't go into because that's a whole other thing. Okay, so we're setting a precedent here. If you're a sexist idiot, Rosemary will abandon you, and then you'll suffer some form of physical harm. Unless, of course, your name happens to be Sage. Oh yes, I haven't forgotten about her. Sage in this very episode is just as much of a sexist idiot as Aster is, if not even more so. She starts going on this weird rant about how girl friendships are superior to guy friendships and a bunch of other dumb bullshit to the point where Snapdragon literally breaks out into tears. Snapdragon and Rosemary are mirrors in this episode because they're both lusting after sexist idiots. Or at the very least, that's what the story wants us to believe. Now, if the characters were being treated equally, Sage would get abandoned by Snapdragon and then get her toes smashed in, but unfortunately that's not what happens because Sage is getting special treatment from the writers. So Snapdragon becomes her best friend, like immediately afterwards, and Rosemary comes running back to her. And all she did to be rewarded with this glorious outcome is just bitch about Aster and Rosemary hooking up for one day. Here we have the story lying to us again. It wants us to believe that Sage is likable and sympathetic, despite the fact she's doing the exact same thing as the character the story wants us to believe isn't likable and isn't sympathetic. And because of that, it makes absolutely no sense and we don't actually buy into what the story is selling us because their marketing is horrible. And by the end of the episode, Sage essentially gets rewarded with everything she wanted. Snapdragon becomes her friend, Rosemary gets back with her again, but she doesn't really deserve all this stuff. The story wants to trick you into thinking she's changed and that she's better and that she deserves this conclusion, but if you actually pay attention to the episode, she doesn't. It's another lie. Because the story just wants us to take it on faith that the reality it's portraying is actually, real. And therein lies the problem, dear viewer, because it's not real. It's false. It's fiction, a fabrication. It is an utter fantasy. Fantasy, eh? See what I did there? No? Yeah, okay. Now, there are other moments in the story that exemplify this, but these two are the big ones that I think really show this problem off. The best way to tell if a story is lying to you is to think critically about what's going on screen and if that actually matches up with what everybody's saying. If it's revealed that the numbers aren't checking out, then you know your story is lying to you and trying to trick you into thinking something that they haven't gone through the effort of actually making sure is true. And that would be it normally, but people are always complaining how I'm so negative all the time and I'm not providing solutions, so why don't I actually fix this bullshit? The first example of the Guardians being evil is super easy to fix. Just actually make them evil. It would be way more interesting and also make a lot more sense. But how do we handle the whole Rosemary-Aster situation? Well, what if instead of Rosemary falling in love with Aster, and that's why Sage is angry this episode, what if instead Rosemary doesn't actually like Aster at all? And the reason Sage is angry with her this whole time isn't because she's hooking up with Aster, it's because she's been acting like an idiot for so long. She's not taking being a Guardian as seriously as she should, and she's acting like a buffoon, which is putting Sage off. During the training course, Rosemary gets paired up with Aster, and Aster just acts like the same buffoon as he usually does. But instead of liking him, Rosemary just hates him for the entire time. And then eventually she realizes, holy shit, I act exactly like Aster. If Aster was annoying me, imagine how annoyed Sage must be when I act like a complete dumbass all the time. And after coming to that conclusion, Rosemary realizes that she needs to actually improve herself if she wants to be even half the Guardian her mother was. So she takes her training more seriously and stops acting like a complete dumbass around Sage all the time, and they actually mend their friendship. There you go. It's really simple, but that took me 3 minutes to come up with, and it's a way better story than this. It gives Rosemary motivation to work harder at achieving her goal of becoming a guardian, and it also gets rid of that whole hypocritical nonsense of her both being an idiot, but also Aster being treated poorly for being an idiot. And it makes Sage look less like a stuck-up prick. There's a lot of ways you can improve this show, which is why it's not surprising there's so many rewrites of it. It yearns to be repaired. But to summarize this video, High Guardian Spice lies to you. A lot. It lies to you a lot. And you fell for it. You fell for it, you fucking morons. You fools, you baboons. You tiny-brained... I'm leaving this take in the video. I'm leaving this take in the video. I'm gonna do that. But yeah, that's the whole video. Man, it feels good to be back. I love complaining. Don't you love complaining? I love it so much. But yeah, this has been Dave, and I am not leaving. I'm doing the opposite of leaving. Okay, bye.
Should have known you were stuck up.